Conservation of Iron. I'm Stacy Loveland, and today we are in the Archaeological Objects Lab at Colonial Williamsburg to explore the history of iron, how it was produced, what some of its 18th century uses were, how archaeologists uncover and study it, and how conservators care for and stabilize it for future study. We'll get to your questions live very soon, so please post them in the comments. Before we do that though, let's introduce our team of experts. Tina Gessler, Senior Object Conservator of Objects, Sean Devlin, Senior Curator of Archaeology, and Ken Schwarz, Master Blacksmith at the Anderson Blacksmith Shop and Armoury. Let's get a quick summary of what each of your teams do. Tina, why don't you tell us a bit about archaeological conservation?
Well, in the conservation department, we work with the curators, historic tradespeople, and the archaeologists to preserve the artifacts for long term.
Wonderful, and we're really glad you guys do that. Sean, what is archaeology and what do archaeologists at Colonial Williamsburg do?
Yeah, so archaeology is basically the study of the past through material objects. Oftentimes we joke that it's the trash that people throw away, but that's the product of their daily lives. So that's the evidence base that we use to learn about life in the past and all the aspects of the community that are here in a place like Williamsburg. So we do that through excavation here at CW.
Wonderful, thrilled you're with us today. And Ken, you work in the Historic Trades and Skills Department. Why don't you tell our audience a bit about historic trades?
Well, in the Historic Trades Department, we try to bring the historic area to life through the work that was done in the time period. And we're recreating objects that are used to rebuild and operate the historic area. But part of our study is to look at the objects that Sean and Tina work with. So archaeological objects reveal to us something about technique and style that we then work to recreate within the workshops.
Wonderful. Well, I'm thrilled you're all here with us today. I think we're going to have a great conversation. But to get us started, let's learn a little more about iron from the historic area of blacksmiths.
I'm Kenneth Schwarz. I'm the Master Blacksmith here at the James Anderson Blacksmith Shop and Public Armory at Colonial Williamsburg. When you come into a new world and you want to make profit, the typical way to do that is through natural resources and agricultural commodities. Settlers arrive at Jamestown in the spring of 1607. By the fall of 1607, John Smith records, "Our best commodity is iron, which we make into little chisels." By 1619, the Virginia Company had raised the capital necessary to begin construction of a large-scale ironworks. So where is the market for that sort of iron? It's really back in England. After hundreds of years of industrialization, they were really running short of an important element for iron production, and that was timber. Estimates are that a single furnace refining iron would burn between 1 and 2 acres of standing timber every 24 hours. By the time of the Revolutionary War, every colony but Georgia had produced iron, and altogether, by some estimates, American production of iron in the 13 colonies was the third biggest production in the world, behind Russia and Sweden. So the blacksmiths here in Williamsburg were buying Virginia-made and Maryland-made bar iron and using that in our work. When the legislators at the Capitol are thinking about independence, separating from Great Britain, they understood that at that point all the military arms that we had here in Virginia were products of English industry. If we wanted to be able to fight a war, we were going to have to develop those industries on our own. In the operation of these furnaces, there are a huge number of laborers. And there's sort of a labor pyramid where at the base of the pyramid you have a tremendous number of people that are processing the inputs. So you got wood cutters and wood splitters and charcoal burners. You've got people that are mining the iron ore. You've got carters that are transporting the materials from where they're being processed into the furnace. And then as you get to the furnace, there are fewer and fewer hands until at the top of the pyramid you have really just a handful of people that are operating the furnace. The iron industry is the second largest user of enslaved labor in Virginia after agriculture. And a lot of that labor is rented labor. You might rent enslaved people from a tidewater plantation just for the season of smelting iron. Now when we look at iron ore, iron is an unstable element. Iron wants to be combined with oxygen. So when you look for iron on the face of the earth, rarely do you find it as a metal. Typically you find it as an oxide. Red iron oxide or rust occurs when you have iron and oxygen and moisture. In our work in the blacksmith shop, when we heat the iron, hot iron coming in contact with oxygen gives you a black iron oxide. So in our work, that's what gives blacksmith work the characteristic black surface. It's an oxidation that comes with heat. In the smelting process, a furnace is built so that it's very tall, and in the upper region of the furnace you have an oxygen-starved zone. If you add the ore from the top, as the ore descends through the furnace, the fire extracts the oxygen from the ore, and then as you get down towards the base of the furnace where the furnace is being fanned, you have the intense heat that allows you to liquefy the iron and the non-iron elements. And then within the furnace, the denser iron will settle to the bottom, the less dense slag will float to the top, and when the furnace operator taps the furnace, the iron runs out onto a floor, sand floor, and it creates ingots which are known as pigs, or pig iron. And that name pig iron comes from early methods of casting the ingots, where you have one long ingot that was known as a sow and small pigs that come off to the side of that, because the workmen viewed it as a sow nursing baby piglets, and therefore they termed the material pig iron. And that term is still used today. So in the refining, essentially that's what you're doing, is removing oxygen. The first byproduct of the furnace is called cast iron. The cast iron, the iron picks up carbon in that smelting process, and that combination of iron and carbon produces cast iron. To get the material we use in the blacksmith shop, there's a further stage of refining that uses an oxidizing fire, a shallow fire that has a lot of oxygen. In this case, the oxygen takes the carbon out, and the raw material for a blacksmith is almost pure iron, which we call wrought iron, wrought meaning worked. And then for some of our material, a small amount of that carbon is put back in, and that makes a third metal called steel. So 3 iron-based materials: cast iron, wrought iron, and steel. In the blacksmith shop, we use 2 of those. We use the wrought iron and steel. Cast iron would be the raw material of a founder. I think without having the resource of iron, building up an iron industry and the manufacturing capability would have been impossible. So that pre-existing iron industry really is important to the decision for independence.
Welcome back. Remember, Ken, Tina, and Sean are here to answer your questions, so please post them in the comments. Let's get started with a question from Erin in San Diego. Erin is asking, what are your favorite objects? And I know we were talking about this a little bit amongst ourselves, so share some of your great answers. Sean, why don't you start?
Okay. Well, I do have a little bit of a cheat answer here, in that one of the most frequent objects that we encounter is nails. So it's not something that's spectacular or amazingly decorative or unique in that sense, but what's really fascinating is the way that we can actually turn these objects that are really the ubiquitous part of structures that sort of equal daily life, right, in the past. And we can actually learn quite a bit from them. So their manufacturing techniques can help us date sites. The form of the nails can actually tell us a little bit about possibly how they were used in the past. So were they part of framing a structure, or were they part of a lath? Were they part of roofing? Something like that. So even the most small objects and sort of ubiquitous objects can really contain a lot of information that I think that's always been my favorite part of my job, dealing with objects.
Answer.
Yeah.
Tina, what about you? Do you have favorites?
Well, yes, my answer is not that much different. I get asked this a lot, and my answer is always whatever I'm working on right now is my favorite object, because they always have a story to tell. I'm very interested in how things are made and what things are made of, and even something as little and mundane as a button has a story to tell. And while I'm working on it, every single thing is my favorite each time.
I have a feeling I'd be the same way. Do you have a favorite object to
I have
make?
to say one of my favorite objects would be weather vanes. We recently made a weather vane on the new entryway for our DeWitt Wallace Decorative Arts Museum. And to have a piece of iron that's in such a prominent position and will be there for a long, long time is kind of cool. And within our community, weather vanes were used to identify important buildings. So there are 7 weather vanes in the town. Each of them was on a public building. So I think that's kind of cool.
That's wonderful. I like the trend of your favorite objects or things you interact with frequently, whether it's seeing it in town, finding a ton of them, encountering them in daily life, literally working with them hands-on every day. I think that's wonderful. It's nice to have those connections to history. Tina is asking us more about the video we just watched. Where were the local mines that supplied Williamsburg?
Well, within the blacksmith shop, we rely on a couple of different types of mines. So the iron ore is common up and down the East Coast. And so the earliest iron they find right around the settlement at Jamestown along the James River. It's a type of iron ore that's called bog ore, and it forms in swamps and marshes. So being on the coast, we have lots of swamps and marshes. Bog ore was pretty common. The other mine that we rely on are the coal mines. So west of us, near Richmond, there were huge coal deposits, and those coal deposits were being excavated, and they supplied our fuel for our work.
Awesome. Now, as a follow-up question to that, what sources do you use for recreating the iron implements that we have at Colonial Williamsburg at CW today?
That's a great question. We study various sources. So we try to find things that were local. So if we can find things that we know were in Williamsburg, that's the best source. And so that means that Sean and Tina are some of our best sources because they're dealing with the things that were excavated right here. If we broaden that out, we'll look within the region. So we look stylistically for objects that were used within the Chesapeake region. So we might study things that are from Maryland or the Eastern Shore, even up into southern Pennsylvania or into the Carolinas. And then if we need more information, we look for sources from England because a lot of the materials that were used here were products of English industry that were imported.
Wonderful. Glad that you're able to get so much of that information and use it today in what you do, all working together. Now, I know some people watching and listening are wondering themselves how they could do this. So how do you train to be a blacksmith?
Well, training in the work of a blacksmith is similar to learning any other skill. You know, if young people out there are playing a musical instrument or involved in sports, you know that it takes lots of practice. So with a hand skill like blacksmithing, that practice period typically is termed an apprenticeship. In the 18th century, a young person in their mid-teens would sign an indenture or a contract where they would trade their labor for room and board and education. And that meant that they were working in the shop, learning the skills, and then they were provided with a place to sleep and food and clothing. And then when they turned 21, they were free to go out and earn wages on their own. So a paid worker was called a journeyman. You're still learning when you're a journeyman because there are always new projects and unusual things that come through a shop. So the real way you learn blacksmithing is through practice and through doing new and different challenging things.
Wonderful. I like the similarities between the past and the present. It's nice.
Yep, absolutely.
However, as important and as exciting as blacksmithing is, we're aware that's not the only metalworking trade. So what other metalworking trades are we seeing?
Yeah, well, I'm biased and think that iron is the most important. People do use other metals. So metals like copper, brass, silver, pewter, bronze. You know, these are other materials that are used to produce things that people within the community relied on for their comfort and security. And maybe you all can speak to the things you find and conserve here in town.
Yeah, I think all those objects, speaking archaeologically, are certainly make up a large amount of our metal collection as well as iron. Certainly the copper alloys seem to be extremely sort of prevalent in our collections. I think, like you're saying, that really sort of reflects to some degree the fact that that material is being used for items of dress or other forms of clothing like buckles, et cetera, right? So there are these items that really are sort of being used in the course of people's daily choices and how they want to present themselves. So they really are these objects that sort of crop up again and again, and people sort of cycle through them in their own sort of personal choice over time. I don't know, Tina, do you guys?
In conservation, we see a lot of silver, and that's partly because there was a lot of silver in the 18th century, but also because, like iron, silver needs a lot of conservation attention. So we see that quite a bit.
Well, it's nice that we have a variety, even if iron might be the superior metal. However, the way you're producing these iron pieces isn't quite as prevalent today, and Gary is asking us about when that changes. Specifically, when would you say that blacksmithing began its decline? When does this change?
Well, with a lot of hand trades, you begin to see the decline as the value of labor rises. So if you look at an 18th century environment, if you're having something made out of metal, the metal generally is worth more than the labor. And that meant that there was a lot of handmade material in the world, labor being a cheap commodity. As the value of labor began to rise and that balance shifts, the time that it takes to make something by hand made it very, very expensive. So that's when you begin to see the decline. You see more mechanical manufacture of objects, machine-made things. And that change is really beginning to occur in the first part of the 19th century. By the 1820s to 40s, you're beginning to see more industrial manufactured objects. And that decline really continues to the present day. More and more industry is turning away from labor and towards machinery because of the value of labor. But there are revivals, and within the present day there's a great revival in iron and steel working, partly driven by some of our material culture. There are television programs with a focus on forging things in iron, and that's driven up the interest. There were books that were written that spurred interest in the trade. So there's probably more interest in blacksmithing now than there was 40 or 50 years ago.
That's a really exciting time for us to be living in right now then. That's wonderful. But if we look before things start to change, before we get into that 19th century decline, we have a question asking, if we're looking at the 18th century when we're still colonies, if iron is mainly an export to Great Britain, what are iron workers here in the colonies doing?
That's a good question. When you look at the economy of the 18th century, England was already a very large industrial power, and largely that was because they had large population centers, and many people competing for work drives down the price. So the cost of manufacture in England was lower, plus you have these big population centers where the quantities being produced were huge. Whereas here in the colonies, we don't really have that many big population centers. If you think about Williamsburg, for all its importance as the capital city, the population was only about 2,000 people, and half of whom were enslaved. So you've got this really small market. But that means that near the coast, we could import English manufactured goods at a reasonable cost. Local workmen, though, had to deal with that competition from imports, so they worked on things that were not available as imports or things that were expensive to import, and did that sort of custom work. Also maintenance. You know, if you buy a lock that was manufactured in England and you break the key, it's cheaper to have a new key made than it is to replace the whole lock. And that's the sort of work that blacksmiths were doing.
Makes a lot of sense. Now, I know in the video you mentioned some of the work that enslaved people were doing with metalworking trades and with metal production, but Lane is asking more specifically if you could tell us the work about enslaved people in a foundry or in a blacksmith shop itself.
Sure. Well, Lane, the enslaved population is largely involved in agriculture. The reason slavery was introduced into the South was the fact that we needed more and more laborers in agricultural industries. But on larger plantations, there's a need for that sort of maintenance work that I described earlier. And they needed supplies of things like shoes and buildings and ground grain to feed people. And there were blacksmith shops at plantations like Mount Vernon or Monticello that employed skilled African laborers who were enslaved. Within Williamsburg, in our shop, in the Anderson shop, during the buildup of the Revolutionary War, when more and more workers were needed within the shop, skilled enslaved people were brought into the shop to do blacksmith work, to repair arms, to shoe horses, you know, all the various ironworking that was needed within the shop. And then if we look broader at the industry, in the iron industry, I said earlier that the iron industry is the largest employer of enslaved Africans outside of agriculture. So you do see many, many skilled Africans involved in work like that.
Thank you for that insight, Ken. Now let's switch our focus to archaeology for a bit. We visited Sean in the archaeology lab to learn a little bit more about iron from the archaeologist's perspective. Check out this video, and as you're watching, remember to keep posting your questions and we'll keep answering them.
Hi, I'm Sean Devlin. I'm the Senior Curator of the Archaeological Collection here in the Archaeology Department at Colonial Williamsburg. Archaeologists study the past through material culture, and material culture is just a fancy way of talking about artifacts, the things we use in daily life. Archaeology complements traditional historical sources to tell us about the communities who lived here. Iron is an important material because it was used in all sorts of objects that would have been important for 18th and 19th century life here at Williamsburg. One of the major issues that we have with archaeological iron is that when it's deposited in an archaeological environment in the ground, it actually corrodes. And that actually can impede our ability to identify it when it first comes out. What's really interesting is despite this corrosion, despite the nature of that, iron actually makes up a quite large percentage of the collections that we recover. It is durable even though it corrodes. Some of that material we will be able to identify here in our lab, and some of that material we'll actually need to do further testing and remove the corrosion to fully identify what the artifact is, and therefore talk a little bit about what its function may have been. Iron actually changed in terms of its manufacturing technique over time. So an object as simple as nails went from being hand forged and hand wrought in the 18th century to being cut by machines right at the turn of the century and into the 19th century. If we find cut nails, we know we're in a certain time period. And if we only find wrought nails, we know we're in a different one. Going further than that, though, and sort of moving into looking at the object and its form, we can also begin to speak a little bit about function. For example, we find lots of iron tools and other iron objects that might be related to labor. Hoes were a key component of the tobacco plantation economy, and actually different hoes have different shapes. So we can speak very directly to the types of labor that those hoes may have been used to conduct. Additionally, other tools that we find may speak to completely different sets of labor. So here I'm talking more about sort of the skilled crafts like carpenter or cooper or even blacksmith here in town. Another really important for archaeologists topic is that of domestic labor. And iron objects, again, are really useful for speaking to some of those aspects of our research. So we have things like scissors. Now, it could have been used for a wide range of things, and that's often the case with archaeological objects. But in this case, scissors may speak to domestic labor in the household, looking at clothing or sewing. More directly, certainly, are iron pots, cast iron pots, and other implements that are associated with the fireplace. And what's more critical to any household than what we eat? Archaeological objects are the product of labor by both free and enslaved members of the community here in Williamsburg in its past. We really depend on the archaeological context and other information sources to sort of speak to identifying those members of the community. I enjoy working with the historic trades because the material that we're uncovering can directly inform information they have about what kinds of objects they want to use in the shops or performing the interactions that they have with the public. We can actually learn quite a bit from that as well. Interacting with the trades folks allows us to see how these objects would have been used, to learn more about wear patterns that we might find on archaeological examples and how that might have actually been caused by the types or the forms of labor that they were doing in the past. So there's a nice rebounding effect between the living history aspects of Colonial Williamsburg and the archaeological research that we're doing currently. Iron objects are treated much the same in excavation as any other object we find. They're excavated from the ground, usually by means of shovels or trowels. Most times they're recovered from screens. At that point, there's no difference between a ceramic, an iron nail, a hoe blade, or anything like that. For example, this helmet that's off to my right actually was recovered from a property outside of Williamsburg and was found crushed in the bottom of a pit. This object was actually lifted and brought to a conservation lab, and work was conducted on it to sort of bring it to the present state that you can see today.
Welcome back, and thank you, Sean, for sharing the archaeologist's viewpoint. We now have some questions specifically for you. First of all, right off the bat, where are iron artifacts most likely to be found in Colonial Williamsburg?
That's a really great question, and I think the reality is we will find iron objects basically any of the archaeological sites we excavate, because as we've referenced before, iron is literally part of the fabric of the structures here. So any place that something's been built, or even to be frank, people are working, there's going to be some iron evidence most likely. That being said, though, different sites will produce different amounts of iron, right? And some of that has to do with the type of site it is. So a ceramic kiln site will have a lot less iron than perhaps Anderson Forge might, where we can see that the evidence of that activity kind of taking place. So it really, without sort of dodging the question too much, but I mean, it'll vary, right? We'll find it everywhere, but it will really vary, and the types of things we'll find will vary to some degree too. So it's a great question to think.
It's nice that you can come across it everywhere, though.
Yeah, exactly. It will always make up part of our collections, right? And in a very, very rule of thumby sense, iron roughly usually accounts for about 30% of an archaeological collection. So by the time that we're dealing in the millions of artifacts that we're dealing with here at Colonial Williamsburg, it's a major component of the material that we're recovering.
So this is a really important subject that we're covering today, and I'm glad you all can be here with us for it. Susie is asking us if cooking utensils and pots and pans have been, or at least the ones we're finding when we excavate, would have been imported from England, or if they would be made here by a blacksmith. So what are we finding, and what would have been common?
Yeah, I think it's a mix when you talk about utensils and vessels. So a lot of the cooking utensils, spoons, forks, spatulas, trivets, there are imported options, but you do also see some that are locally manufactured, and they show up in the accounts of some of the shops here. A lot of the cooking vessels, especially the larger cooking pots, are made of cast iron, and that's a different material altogether. So in our shop, we work with wrought iron and we work with steel. Those are metals that can be hammered into shape. A cast iron has a different composition, and it's very brittle, so you can't hammer on it, but you can melt it and pour it into a mold. And a lot of cooking vessels are made of cast iron, so skillets, cooking pots, and the like. And those likely could be local objects as well.
That's right. Yeah, and we also, I worked at a plantation prior to this, and we could look in the documentary records. And I think there's also an element of who is it who's actually doing the ordering, right? Plantation owners oftentimes are using their agricultural crops and actually shipping them over to Europe where they're sold, and that's used as credit to buy items that are then shipped back to the plantation owner there, right? So people in different economic classes may have access to different venues for different markets for those goods as well, right?
So we know what's common. We have records that we can often connect certain pieces at certain sites to where they may have come from. But Tina, I have a follow-up question. Can you tell if you get something pulled out of the earth, can you tell where the metal came from? Is there anything that you might discover, if you don't know anything else about it, just coming out of the dirt, that could tell you where it was coming from, if it was imported, if it was local? Are there any clues left to us in the labs?
In some cases we can. So when it is excavated, the iron will have concretions and soil attached. And I mean, if it's excavated here and Sean excavated it, we know where it came from and where it was used. But if we don't, we can do analysis on the soil to find out where it was buried. But in terms of where the iron itself came from, that's a lot more difficult, because like the wrought iron that Ken works with is almost pure iron. And one of the ways that you can tell where something came from is trace impurities, but there's just not a lot in wrought iron. It's essentially iron, and then steel is iron with carbon. So typically that's pretty difficult.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
It's very important to have those additional records to help us out. Thank you. What is the most challenging thing, as an archaeologist specifically, about handling a suspected iron artifact right out of the ground?
Yeah, it's another great question. And again, too, I think the answer will vary a little bit depending on what the object actually is. So some iron objects, we kind of referenced already, they'll corrode in the ground, and they'll actually develop a pretty protective shell around them. That corrosion actually keeps them relatively stable in the ground. And so as long as you don't disturb that corrosive surface, right, you can feel pretty good about, moving it around, handling it, putting in bags. As sort of discussed in the video, a lot of our objects are actually recovered from screening dirt through metal mesh screens. So a lot of our iron objects, like nails, are fairly stable in that sense. Every once in a while, we'll find an object such as the helmet that was featured in the video. And because of the nature of that object, it was already crushed. It had been in an environment where it was corroding. We may actually choose, in those circumstances, to use alternate techniques for recovering the object. Right? We may not try and actually physically lift it out with our hands like we would a nail out of an archaeological layer. We actually will do a little engineering project and sort of create a little box and actually excavate a square of soil and lift an object that we sort of deem as too fragile in the field to sort of remove in any other way. And that's done with the conservators. And actually that soil block, that lift is what we call it, comes back into the conservation lab where our conservators can sort of help us excavate it and also stabilize the object in that process.
Right, because it's a whole lot easier to carefully remove an object from the surrounding soil in an environment like this. It's really difficult to do out in the field where there's no microscope and the light's not very good. So the block lifts are great for that.
That makes a lot of sense, and it's nice to see how easily and seamlessly your departments can work together.
Yeah.
John has actually asked us another question about two departments here working together. John is asking, do archaeologists ever work in the blacksmith shop to learn more about iron and the 18th century process behind it?
We were having a conversation about this earlier. I'm looking forward to doing it, but and there is an entire subfield within archaeology that's really about sort of sometimes we term it experimental archaeology, but it's about physically doing these processes. And I'd love to have the opportunity to come in and do that in the workshop here.
And I know the question wasn't about conservation, but I've had the opportunity to work briefly in Ken's blacksmith shop, and it helps me to understand the materials that I'm working with if I see how they're made and actually got to do it a little bit myself.
Yeah.
And that's an important element of the work also. We do work periodically with curators and conservators and archaeologists to show them some of the working characteristics of the material, and it better informs them when they're analyzing objects to add to a collection or to do conservation work. So it really is a team effort within the museum environment.
It's wonderful being here at Colonial Williamsburg where we're able to have and to facilitate that. Now we're going to get to visit with Kate McEnroe for more about the process archaeological conservators engage in. And then after that video, we'll be back once more to answer your questions, so keep sending them in.
I'm Kate McEnroe. I'm the Associate Conservator for Archaeological Materials here at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. Conservators are responsible for the physical integrity of artifacts. For archaeology, a lot of that comes down to stabilization and often cleaning. When archaeologists uncover something in the field, it's usually taken back to the lab for cataloging. Depending on the artifact's type and its condition, it may or may not receive any washing in the lab. It then comes here for further assessment, or in some cases, its first assessment. Cleaning can be really important in revealing surface details that archaeologists haven't had a chance to see yet. We're responsible for the more than 60 million artifacts that are part of our archaeological collection, both what's currently being excavated and what we have excavated throughout the 20th and 21st century. That can include glass, ceramics, stone, but a lot of what we treat ends up being metal artifacts because they have special needs and are more prone to problems such as corrosion. X-rays are incredibly important for identifying iron artifacts. One of the reasons is that when iron is excavated, it's usually obscured by a thick surface of concretion and soil, meaning you can't actually see the iron artifact. In some cases, you can, like in these barrel hoops here. We knew what they were as soon as they were revealed in the field, and I actually got a chance to visit them before they were excavated. However, X-rays are still important because they can speak to any structural issues, such as cracks that may not be visible to the naked eye. After we take a series of X-rays, usually the conservator and the curator meet to review the X-rays in conjunction with the artifacts. Through this, we can usually identify the majority of the artifacts before treatment, and together select those that would make the most sense for treatment based on our research goals and what will handle the treatment well based on its structural integrity. Mechanical cleaning for iron objects is different than all of the other types of materials that we treat. We typically use something called air abrasion, where fine, hard powders are processed through a small nozzle that we aim safely at the artifact in an enclosed space. This allows us to dislodge the soiling and concretion from the surface of the artifact while preserving its actual original surface. I have noticed that fragments from cooking vessels, such as iron cooking pots, tend to take much longer during air abrasion. And I imagine this has to do with the natural chlorides and other chemicals that are absorbed in the iron structure during the cooking process. After mechanical cleaning, most iron, if it's stable, then goes through a process we call desalination. The goal of desalination is to remove the majority of these harmful salts, particularly chlorides, from within the structure of the iron. However, we know through numerous studies that we're never able to remove all of the chlorides, and this is why we must always have vigilance in the future while we're preserving these artifacts. After desalination, rinse, and dry, we often need to do a bit more cleaning to finish revealing the surface before we apply our final coating. The coating, which is typically a conservation-grade acrylic that we know can last for decades, is partly there as a stabilization method to ensure that any flakes or fragments are well adhered to the surface, and also partly as an aesthetic treatment. The goal of conservation is to preserve artifacts for as long as possible so that visitors, researchers, and staff can continue to interact with the physical material. For iron, it is often rehoused and returned to the Archaeological Collections Building, where it's available for these activities. Specific artifacts are also selected for display at the Art Museums of Colonial Williamsburg.
Welcome back. Keep sending in your questions for Tina, Ken, and Sean. But for right now, we're going to get started with a basic question that we should cover. What is an objects lab?
Well, that's a really good question because it confuses a lot of people. Because we talk about objects as being, everything in the collection, each is an object, but the objects lab actually cares for a particular type of object. So we have conservation labs that care for paper and paintings and upholstery and furniture, textiles. I like to tell people the objects lab is everything else, all the cooler stuff, the stuff that's, decorative arts, sculpture. Most of the metal in the collection is considered an object.
Okay. That makes sense. Wonderful. Well, since we are talking about these metals, we have a question asking, what do you have to do to keep the iron from deteriorating any further while it's in storage, while it's on its way to be worked on here? How do you stabilize that?
Well, as the trend has been, the answer is again, it depends. But in general, iron likes to be very dry. So once it's excavated, that's probably the main consideration is once it's stabilized, keeping it dry for long-term preservation.
That makes a lot of sense. A little tricky here with the humidity, I'm sure.
Right, but sometimes we do more than that, but that would be sort of the overarching principle.
That's a good starting place.
And that's something that we sort of work with the conservation labs through as we go from field excavation to the material coming in here. Actually, none of our metal gets washed. A lot of our ceramics or glass might actually literally get washed with water to help clean it and identify it. But the metal objects don't do that because we do want to conserve their that protective shell until it's actually been able to be looked at by the conservation lab.
Right, but on the flip side, if something has come from a wet burial environment, then
yeah.
we want to keep it wet.
Yeah.
So there's never a straightforward answer.
Very good.
It always
right.
depends.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I like that conservation starts the second you pull it out of the ground. I really like that it starts, right when you guys are getting your hands on it with archaeology. And speaking of things that have been pulled out of the ground, we have a question coming in from Erin about the helmet we saw in your video, Sean. Erin wants to know specifically how old that helmet was.
So that helmet was actually recovered from Martin's Hundred, which is an early 17th century settlement here in Virginia, one of the first after Jamestown. And the context in which it comes from is about 1622.
Wow.
So it is one of the earliest objects that we have in our collection.
That's great. Almost 400 years old.
Yeah,
That's so cool.
yeah.
That's amazing. Now, I think a lot of people have been enjoying the program today, and it sounds like some of them want to come and join us in person. Erin specifically is asking, does Colonial Williamsburg offer an apprenticeship or fellowship programs or classes that are open to the public for people who want to be more involved with all this? And I'm going to let each of you answer how it works for your own departments.
Do you want to start?
Sure, yeah. Well, so in archaeology, we traditionally have a very strong volunteer program, and I'm sure lots of us do. So we try to engage folks through that. We also have internship programs, and we are always welcoming in outside researchers, scholarly researchers, and professional researchers to come into our department and sort of use our collection to further their own work. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. In conservation, we have a variety of opportunities. So to become a conservator, you usually have a master's degree. So we have pre-program internships for people getting the experience they need to go into school. Those are typically volunteer positions. But then we also have internships for almost trained conservators who are in their final year of their program, and they come here for a year sort of like advanced training. And then we do also offer fellowships for postgraduate conservators. So there's a good variety of opportunities in that regard.
It's wonderful.
And within the blacksmith shop and the trade shops in general, we do offer apprenticeships, but apprenticeship is a full-time career position. You work up through an apprentice level into a journeyman level, and then perhaps even to the master of the shop. So an apprenticeship is designed as about a 5 or a 6 year program to develop your skills, similar to an 18th century apprenticeship, but that's full-time employment within the shop. We do also have internships in the blacksmith shop and in many of the other trade shops. They're generally offered in the summer, sometimes in the fall. Those jobs are posted through Colonial Williamsburg's website. So these paid internships are 10-week opportunities to work in the shop with members of each workshop. As for classes, we don't offer classes right now within the workshops. Remember, our shop's set up to be a functional 18th century workshop, not really a classroom. But we're exploring the possibility of setting up classroom environments for teaching some of these skills. Meanwhile, there are many, many other classrooms or schools out there that teach short-term workshops with this sort of work. That might be the place to start.
Just to add to what Ken said, the opportunities available in conservation will also be posted on the Colonial Williamsburg website.
Yes, and if you're interested, please do check out our website. Come join us. I think it's wonderful here. Matt is asking more specifically about kind of this career progression. What does an apprentice blacksmith have to do to become a journeyman? And I know there's a lot of similarities between the 18th century and the 21st century program here at Colonial Williamsburg, but specifically, what are we looking at in the 18th century?
Okay, in the 18th century, generally an apprenticeship has to do with age. So in most cases, an apprenticeship will end on your 21st birthday. When you're 21, then you're entitled to wages. If you're paid wages for your work, then you're called a journeyman. I think that term, people take the word journey to mean that apprentices, or after an apprenticeship, you traveled around to learn. I think the origin probably is the word jour, which means day in French. So a journeyman being a day laborer or getting paid by the day. In the present day, apprentices, generally when we hire them, they're more than 21 years old, and they work through a set of skills. So in the present day, you have to prove your ability. In the 18th century, you proved your ability on whether or not somebody would pay you for your work.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. Now we have a question coming in specifically for Tina from Aaron. Aaron wants to know, how exciting is it to work with some of the interesting yet everyday silver artifacts like spoons, etc.? And then adds, Paul Revere was a silversmith, right?
Yes, Aaron, Paul Revere was a silversmith. So I do work with a lot of silver, and it's interesting to compare the silver from very famous silversmiths like Paul Revere to silver made by other silversmiths. And a lot of the difference is who made it. There are not, otherwise they're quite similar. I don't know if that answers the question.
Maybe I could just follow on
Please.
and sort of say what's really interesting, I find, and maybe all of us actually find interesting, is you can, by detailed looking at each object that's sort of passing in front of us, you can actually see a sort of biography in its making, its use, and its disposal. So I really agree that's one of the most fascinating parts. I may not always know the name of the person who made it, but it's really fantastic to sort of be able to piece together some of that story. I think.
And I feel like you
I
all
agree.
kind of addressed that earlier too, mentioning some of your favorite artifacts or just the things that people used every day that we can connect to our modern day lives. A spoon is something we still use, so thinking about holding something that was held by someone 300 years ago doing the same thing with it.
Well,
It's inherently
speaking of
nice.
spoons, so silver spoons are a very soft material, and one of my favorite things about the thousands of spoons that I've seen is some of them are very worn on one side of the bowl, and you can tell that this was somebody's favorite spoon, and they scraped it into a bowl so many times that it's worn off on the edge, and that just makes the spoon come alive and not be just a spoon anymore.
That's incredible to be able to know. That's wonderful. Thanks for that question, Erin. Unfortunately, we are starting to run out of time, so this is the last question we're going to be able to answer. Parker has asked us, are there resources for locals if they find objects, metallic and otherwise? And just in general, how can folks get an archaeologist or conservator to help with iron objects?
Well, I can speak to how someone could find a conservator. So there is an institution called the American Institute for Conservation, and they have a website where you can find a conservator in your area who will work on the specific types of materials that you are looking for.
And we can post a link to that. It's a great resource.
Absolutely.
I could follow up too. I mean, there are many ways to sort of contact archaeologists. There are archaeologists working in all sorts of different contexts, museums, and private companies, and at the state. I would suggest, if you're interested, to visit the state's website, the Virginia Department of Historic Resources, and there's contact information there for how to get in touch with folks at the state level who will help you sort of navigate those choices that you might want to make.
Wonderful. I'm glad there's people out there who are finding cool things and want to take care of them properly. So thank you guys for that. Unfortunately, we are now out of time. I have to thank you all so much for joining us. This has been such an interesting deep dive into iron as a utilitarian and necessary material, one that can tell us so much about daily life in the past. We are incredibly lucky here at Colonial Williamsburg for our unique opportunities to study iron. We're a museum where the story of iron can be told from remains found in the ground using archaeology, the preservation of the material through conservation, and by recreating iron objects by our blacksmiths, all just to better understand the lives of the people of the past. I'd like to say thank you again to our experts. Thanks for joining us today. And also to the individuals who funded this project. What you see today was funded in part by a generous grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. And of course, we'd like to thank you, too, our audience. And remember, when you're considering history, always consider the sources.